This is the Long Island Radio Magazine. April is National Poetry Month, and in this edition, arts and literary correspondent Dan Moran celebrates by journeying to Greenwich Village to speak with poet Samuel Menashe. We'll hear the first half of their conversation today, with conclusion broadcast next week in this same time period.
Hi, this is your arts and literary correspondent, Dan Moran, and welcome once again to the Long Island Radio Magazine. This broadcast is coming to you from the heart of Greenwich Village at 8th Street and McDougal, on a spot on the globe which has seen a genesis of thought and art and social conscience, which will someday be compared to ancient Athens or Rome, we'll ask Samuel about that, or even Paris of 1900. One of the men who has figured well in this world is my guest and dear friend, the poet Samuel Menashe. Several years ago, the New York Public Library set out a landmark exhibit called Hand of the Poet, which displayed priceless manuscripts and memorabilia from 100 poets of antiquity, and then from 100 poets who have defined the 20th century. Among them was Samuel Menashe. Among those things which make Samuel unique is his near-total reliance upon a precise and spare use of words, constructed to both enlighten and delight, and often surprise. I'm so very pleased to share him with you in celebration of National Poetry Month in an interview to be conducted in two parts. And Samuel, I'm only hoping that we can contain ourselves to that limited amount of time. Do you think we'll be able to do that? Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, it is, in fact, National Poetry Month, as I said, and as far as I know, in New York, there won't be any fireworks in the East River, or no regatta of the tall ships, and no quaintly wrapped packages under an amputated pine tree for the occasion. Now, if, as you and I agree, poetry is the most perfect and enduring of humanity's creations, are we kidding ourselves? Where's the parade?
Well, you take me by surprise. It is one of the most enduring, I would say, humbly.
Maybe you could start off by giving us a few of your poems, just to frame the moment and give people an idea of what it is that you do, and make any explanation you feel necessary to make things more comfortable.
Well, one of the poets renowned in Greenwich Village, and who made for the renown of the village in the 20s, was Edna St. Vincent Millay. The little house she lived in is still visible, the smallest house in the village. I think it's on Barrow Street. At any rate, she wrote many poems. One of them became the banner of the 20s, the Roaring 20s. They thought it was the Roaring 20s. They didn't know how the roar would increase. But for that time, it was the Roaring 20s. She said, "My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light." Well, many years ago, I was up at a colony which was founded on her property near Austerlitz, New York.
Steepletop?
Yes, that's right. And I forgot for the moment. At any rate, and she's buried in the forest there. The urn of her ashes is buried there. Here's under some white birch trees. And I wrote a poem called At Millay's Grave. Your ashes in an urn buried here make me burn for dear life. My candle at one end. Night outlasts wick and wax, foe and friend.
That's very beautiful. That's quite a place. I've been up there myself. It's very beautiful. The Malay Colony for the Arts, I believe.
That's right.
The colony up there. Now, I would tend to classify you perhaps as a traditionalist, something which is not at all fashionable these days in poetry. Does that give you the kiss of death to suggest that you're a traditionalist in this world of avant-garde and deconstructionism and all those other crazy things?
Well, I'm not worried about what I'm called. If the use of rhyme rather than free verse is traditional, I do use rhyme, inner rhyme, half rhymes, and even end rhymes. And I always hark back to Robert Frost, who said, trying to write poetry without rhyme is like trying to play tennis without a net.
It's an interesting thought. So do you usually try to rhyme when you're writing a poem, or is it something that just happens as part of your intention?
No, it just happens. I didn't decide to be a poet, and I didn't decide how to make poems. That's how it happened.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, I never would have. In my day, and I love to say in my day because I'm 72 years old, almost 73, in my day, there were no poetry workshops. One never expected to meet a poet. A poet was a dead immortal. That one would decide to be a poet was absolutely unheard of. But, so I didn't decide how to be a poet. It just happened. I was a student in Paris under the GI Bill after the war. I had been there in Europe in the infantry as a young man, and I happened to write a poem.
And that's how it started.
Do
you remember what that poem was?
Yes, it's never been published.
That's all right.
And
it'll be broadcast anyway.
Great. Paris has very dingy winters, but I even know when it was, February 21st, 1949. And I've been writing short stories about my childhood or about the war. And then I just woke up in the middle of the night under a window without curtains, and it was a very clear night. And the sudden awakening seemed to thrust me among the stars without a rocket. All my life, when I woke up at night, there was darkness in a room, and quickly I'm asleep. Here I have found a bed beneath a window, no purpose in this place, by an unpatterned hazard of neglect, and yet, in its crossing of my ordinary fate, it is among stars that I awake.
That's beautiful. I don't know why that was never published.
Well, I don't know whether I sent it out.
That would be a good reason. What effect did Paris have on your thinking? You did spend quite a bit of time there. And what was your reason for being there? You were educated there.
Well, when I came back, I had college very early. At 16, I went to a school where everybody graduated at 15 or 16 called Townsend Harris. The oldsters may remember. It was like Hunter College High School, but for boys. At any rate, so I came back after the war, and I had about a year and a half to finish. And I had been a biochemistry major, but I finished up quickly as a writing major or something. I don't remember exactly. And I was sent by the employment service of Queens College, Flushing, New York, for an interview with and I didn't know that advertising was the indicated career. And I realized I didn't want to do that. And I had the GI Bill, so I went back to France. And I had to matriculate for a degree in order to get the stipend, $75 a month, which was enough to live on. And I was writing, and I felt very glamorous. I was in Paris writing, maybe a little bit in the image of the Lost Generation. And then that's how it began.
Now, I was going to ask you about your generation. I see you as part of a generation that really began after World War II. And, of course, in this country, the generation that we most associate coming to life after World War II was the Beat generation. And I know that all of that was happening around you all the years that you were here in New York. What influence did they have on you? It doesn't seem to me that your poetry reflects their point of view very much, which is to your credit, I think, to a large degree. But what did the Beats mean to you, and did they mean anything to you? And do you consider them to be part of your thinking at all?
No. And they thought even less of me. And they prevailed, and I didn't.
They did. But time may prove them wrong. We'll have to see. Do you have another poem that you could delight us with?
Oh, I have a lot of poems.
Oh, pick whichever one comes to mind first.
Yes, I used to believe, no, I didn't believe, not a matter of belief, but if I broke a mirror, I always thought, well, at least I have to live another 7 years. I will live another 7 years to have that bad luck. Well, now that I'm much older and not in perfect health, I haven't got that confidence. And I wrote this poem, Off the Wall. Broken mirror off the wall, all of a piece with the past, whose splinters glint like glass stuck in the sole of my shoe. If I'm out of luck and down at the heel too, are 7 years enough? Time for me to do.
That's wonderful. You know, you and I have had very lengthy discussions about where poems come from and how people write them, and I know that I've confessed to writing fairly inspirationally, which is sort of an insanity of its own, but do you write that way, or do you give a great deal of thought? Do you try to put things together little by little? Is a poem something that takes you a great many weeks or months to finish, or does it come as a burst?
Well, no, I have to have the inspiration for the first line.
Is that where it comes from, the first line?
I mean, suddenly there's a line, and then I have something to work with, and it can take a long time. I'm not prolific.
I think you're fairly prolific. But everybody seems to have different attitudes about poetry. Right now, it seems that the academics really have a stranglehold on the world of poetry. And what is your exposure to them, and how important is it that everybody's trying to be the same somehow, or trying to please some great unknown editor in the sky to find themselves in some lofty magazine? Is that a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, I like all people who write, I aspire to be published, and I have been intermittently. Well, there's a whole network of poet professors, which didn't exist before. I mentioned the Poetry Workshop, and there are spin-offs of the poetry. The big name Poetry Workshop produces other poets to teach other poetry workshops in lesser colleges and more remote places. And I have taught intermittently and mostly tutoring French and things like that. I had 2 academic jobs, but I quit each time. And so since I'm not in that network, I cannot go on the college circuit. If I met a college professor who's a poet teaching a workshop, or just at a college as the poet in residence, he will not. If I meet him, I have nothing to offer him. The right hand washes the left. He will invite a colleague at another college, and that colleague will read in his college in spring, and he will read there in the autumn. So I'm very excluded from that powerful network.
A lot of back scratching.
Yes, whatever polite term you want to use for it. And then, of course, all these poet professors, the most famous of them, I should say, then award each other the MacArthur Award for neglected genius.
You know, a lot of the popularity of poetry these days makes me very pleased, but also concerns me to a great degree, too. And it seems as though everybody wants to be a poet or a painter. And I see a lot of this is reminiscent to me of something that used to be on television in my childhood. It was a fellow named John Nagy who used to teach people how to paint. And you'd have your easel and your paints, and he would be on the television, and he would tell you exactly how to do this. And it seems that there are endless numbers of people today who are willing to teach people how to write poetry the same way. And one of the questions that I've asked many of the people I've interviewed over the years, almost all of whom were poet professors at one time or another, is if they could really teach poetry to someone, or if this is something that has a mystical quality that can't be taught. In your experience of teaching poetry, do you feel that you could teach poetry to someone?
No, I never taught.
You didn't teach poetry?
No, I never taught it. And moreover, as I said, I never had a poetry workshop. When I said I took some writing courses, I took one in the short story. Queen's College did have a short story course after the war. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think an essay course. Mm-hmm. But I didn't take a poetry workshop. There was none yet. Maybe I would have done what all the others do.
They're all over the place now. I think that people can make a living somehow by teaching poetry to other people.
Well, I find also that it's the culture of self-expression, and who am I to say why I have no more permission or right to try to write a poem than anybody else. Mm-hmm. But what I notice is the roots of this zeal to be a poet are often very shallow, in that the people do not know any. Most people do not know any poetry by heart. They never loved a poem well enough, most people, to memorize it. And if I recite a sonnet of Shakespeare, that's considered a wild achievement. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, everybody no one should be denied the right to try to make a poem. Then try to get it published if you can.
That's another story. I know I've confessed to you, and we sort of laughed about it, that I've often said to people that I would like to see my poetry featured in all the magazines that print poetry that I can't stand. I don't know why that is. But it seems that what is good poetry today is a very confusing thing, especially to poets.
Yes. Moreover, what is interesting is that when I was half my present age and less, and I had a few good magazine credentials. I was published, I think the first one was in the Yale Review when I was 31, and then the Antioch Review, Harper's. If I got past the receptionist and got to see an editor,
mm-hmm.
and he was a graduate of Brown, or maybe sometimes a woman too, or Harvard or Radcliffe, in literature, graduated English or literature, he would boast about the fact that he never reads poetry. Poets read poetry. Engineers read engineering manuals. So the literate editor, as most literate people who does not read poetry, he sends it out to the house poet. Now, ideally, that's what you want, the judgment of your peers. But the house poet brings in the kind of poetry that buttresses his own.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in effect, if you're not of one of the literary gang that controls the publication of poetry, because almost all the poetry editors of literary magazines are poets too, then you have a very hard time. And I got through the interstices of this interlocking directorate by sending my poems to an English poet I heard recite at the Y. Her
mm-hmm.
name is Kathleen Raine. She's still alive at around 98, thank
mm-hmm.
God. And she never heard of me, because no one had, and very few still do, to this day. Anyway, she liked my poems very much. She was teaching at Cambridge, and I thought of her as a Blake scholar primarily, and she got them published in England,
mm-hmm.
and wrote the foreword to the book. One of the leading English publishers of the time, 1961, the book came out, Victor Gollancz. I had the lead review in the New Statesman, which was then read by the intelligentsia here. There was no New York Review of Books. I had wonderful reviews elsewhere. Friends thought the American publisher would be waiting at the pier for me. On the contrary, the people who had dismissed me here were infuriated that I did so well in England, and the door was slammed even harder in my face. It took me 10 years with those excellent English credentials to get my first book out by a virtually unknown publisher in New York.
But you have still to this day enjoyed great popularity in England and Ireland, which I think is fascinating too. You had said to me one time, quoted, that no man is a prophet in his own country, and that may in part be true of you, although I consider you to be very prominent here in New York. You may not see yourself that way.
That's because you're from Shelter Island. You are prominent in Shelter Island, and that's the place to be prominent. But at any rate, no, it's a nice thing to say no man is a prophet in his own country. First of all, I don't, maybe I am a prophet, but I don't aspire to that. I just hope to make a good poem. But it's a nice thing to say for a while, but to live a lifetime with that motto, which is not mine,
mm-hmm.
But I fulfill, is not very pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Actually,
go ahead.
No, actually, yeah, I've fared very well. Even now, I was invited to the Literary Festival just last year at this time in Galway, the Kirch Literary Festival in Ireland, and to Hay on Wye in England, and Penguin brought out my poems there in Penguin Modern Poets series, which is not published here. I was
mm-hmm.
one of the few American poets in it. So I'm very grateful to the Irish and the English and the Irish.
Mm-hmm. But your poetry is available in the stores here, I would assume.
Where I leave it on consignment.
That's okay. Would you please us with another poem?
Oh, I'd love to say another poem. A village poet dead many years, Jean Garrigue, had walls which were bookshelves, and she kept some books on the windowsill as you might keep plants. Using the window ledge as a shelf for books does them good. Bindings are belts to be undone. Let the wind come. Hard covers melt. Welcome the sun. An airing is enough, at this point I open the book, to spring the lines which type confines, but for pages uncut, rain is a must.
And could I make a special request as we close down to the first half of the interview here of the poem Transplant, which I'm very fond of.
Oh, yes, I like it too. I read about transplants all the time. Transplant. I would give my liver, kidneys, heart itself for you to live in perfect health with me, your clone, whose grafted cells grow marrow, bone. If all else fails, do not reject my skin or nails. Whatever is left of me for you, by a hair's breadth, will see us through.
That is very beautiful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll continue this. This is your arts and literary correspondent, Dan Moran. You've been listening this week to the first half of an interview in celebration of National Poetry Month, which is this April, of course, with the eminent poet Samuel Menashe. Please tune in next time as we conclude our discussion and offer you some more of the poems and the insights of one of America's best poets, Samuel Menashe. Until next time.
Dan Moran's conversation with Samuel Menashe will be broadcast next Thursday at 5:35 p.m. Mr. Menashe will be reading at the Riverhead Free Library Tuesday, May 5th at 7:30. The Long Island Radio Magazine is a production of WPBX, Long Island's public radio. We'd like to hear from you. You can mail your comments to WPBX, Southampton College of Long Island University, 239 Montauk Highway, Southampton, New York, 11968. For the Long Island Radio Magazine, I'm Jeff Whalen. April is National Poetry Month, celebrated with arts and literary correspondent Dan Moran on the Long Island Radio Magazine as he continues his conversation with poet Samuel Menashe Thursday at 5:35 p.m. on WPBX, Long Island's public radio.
It's now 5:35. You're listening to WPBX 88.3 FM, broadcasting from the Southampton College of Long Island University. Listener-supported public radio serving Long Island and southern New England with news, jazz, classical, and progressive sounds. Now 45 degrees outside our studios here at Southampton College. Tonight's forecast, periods of rain ending towards daybreak, lows in the low to mid-40s. For tomorrow and Friday, cloudy at first, but partial sunshine in the afternoon, high 65 to 70 degrees. Friday night, clouding up, a chance of sprinkles after midnight, lows in the 40s. Saturday, a mixture of sun and clouds, high 65 to 70 degrees. Stay tuned to WPBX. Coming up next, it's the Long Island Radio Magazine. You're listening to 88.3 FM.
This is the Long Island Radio Magazine. In celebration of National Poetry Month, in this week's edition, arts and literary correspondent Dan Moran continues his interview with poet Samuel Menashe.
Hi, this is your arts and literary correspondent Dan Moran, and welcome once again to the Long Island Radio Magazine. Today, and last time, in honor of National Poetry Month, I am honored and most pleased to continue for you my discussion with the eminent New York poet Samuel Menashe. As I described to you last time, Samuel is a poet among poets, and his reputation extends beyond these shores to Great Britain and Ireland, where he is as well known, if not more so, to the English and Irish than he is here in the United States, but of course very well known here in the United States as well. Welcome back, Samuel.
Not that well known. No, I'm about to be known where you broadcast.
That's right. Yes. Can we start with a taste of some of your poems just to get us in the mood?
Oh,
a taste of a few. Yes.
One of my poems actually entered a cookbook, apropos taste. I didn't write it for a cookbook, but a woman came up to me after I recited it and asked if she could use it in her cookbook. Salt and pepper. Here and there, white hairs appear on my chest. Age seasons me, gives me zest. I am a sage in the making, sprinkled, shaking. Since we're laughing, I'd like to continue with one poem of yours which put me in very good spirits.
Oh, okay. Let's put us in good spirits then.
Good. And the poem is God. He is the beginning and the end, the bearer of all forevers. His fingertips swirl galaxies. His eye sees the very codes of life. With his mercy, he brought forth purgatory and men with two cheeks. In his wisdom, he wished a deluge upon the earth and fashioned Darwin from the muck. He is more than we dare know, and yet less than we can imagine. He made tin men and popes, black holes and the aurora borealis, nickels and Himalayas. He is love, and love is blind. He loves a good fight. He enjoys his fame. He had me fail geometry and made trees which became the masts of ships and the bunks in death camps. He conceived of hummingbirds and nuclear physics. He is indeed most righteous. In his firmament evil never triumphs. He makes plaster Madonnas weep and causes deserts and cancer and snowflakes and stillbirths and fireflies and widows and shadows and the apocalypse. He knows everyone by name, and he listens to prayers. He is the landlord, the taxman, and the concierge. He is surely one of us.
I usually wait to hear a clap of thunder after I read that at a reading. I'm glad I didn't hear one this time again.
Well, you got it from me.
Oh, thank you. Now, Samuel, both you and I have been to many, many poetry readings. We have heard many, many poets, maybe even hundreds, and I should tell the audience that many of them are not very good at reading their poetry. You are well renowned for how wonderful you read. You've got a mellifluous voice, to say the least. And your voice adds a great deal to your poetry, where it seems that many poets have their poetry diminished somehow by their actually expressing it with their voice. Did you have some special training? How did you get to be so good at this?
No, it's a gift. But on the other hand, I do resist this business of people who tell me that when they hear me read, they really get the poem. I always say, you can't sing what's not in the score. But I like to recite. I love to recite. Moreover, as you know from attending a reading, I don't read, I recite, which is considered unusual. I know other people's poems by heart because I memorize them, but I know my own because I made them, and also they're not very long. Let's see.
You couldn't see Eliot memorizing The Wasteland or something.
I'm sure he
like
knew
that.
it by heart.
Do you think he did?
Oh, yes. Yeah, nowadays people don't learn poetry by heart, but for generations of the so-called centuries of the oral culture, poetry was learned by heart and transmitted orally. Even Homer was transmitted that way long before it was written. Mm-hmm. Now people are very lazy about memorizing poetry. They claim the teacher made them do it and that's why they don't like it, or nonsense like that. I think memorizing a poem, the exercise, strengthens the spirit as much as physical exercise strengthens the body. It
was something that I did even in school as a child, the memorization of poetry and things of that sort. Even I remember memorizing the Gettysburg Address as a child in grammar school, and these things were supposedly good exercise for your mind. I don't think children do that anymore, though.
Unfortunately. You asked me to recite a few poems of mine, but I digress because of your poem.
Go ahead.
Now that we've put some distance between your poem and mine, I can go to my own. I've lived in one flat for 41 years. I'm not boasting about that. It's a nice anecdote of one's bohemian youth to refer to. Oh, you remember that flat, that cold water flat on Thompson Street with the bathtub in the kitchen? But that's the anecdote of upper middle class people who lived in such a flat for about a year and a half or two. Well, unfortunately, I've lived there for 42 years, and that's like being left back. Anyway, at a standstill, that statue, that cast of my solitude, has found its niche in this kitchen where I do not eat, where the bathtub stands upon cat feet. I did not advance. I cannot retreat. Then a few other poems in that line. Oh, getting up to the 5th floor. These stone steps, beveled by feet, endear the dead to me as I climb them every night. Or the woman across the street in the tenement just below, south of mine. I have a nice view without buildings and a great eastern sky, but she's a little below, or was for many years. She died a little while ago. Windows, old widow. There is a pillow on the windowsill, her elbow room. In the twin window, enclosed by a grill, plants and pots bloom on the windowsill. And you're always asked what you really do. There's a great concern for your livelihood on the part of perfect strangers. Do you write poetry all the time? Or we know you can't make a living as a poet. So I wrote self-employed. Piling up the years, I awake in one place and find the same face, or counting the time since my parents died, certain less is left than was spent. I am employed every morning, whose ore I coin without knowing how to join lid to coffer, pillar to groin. Each day hinges on the same offer.
Contrary to what most people think, writing poetry is a 24-hour-a-day job in many ways, is it not? I mean, are you not studying the life, the world around you and your inner thoughts and feelings almost all the time?
You're overworked. No.
Maybe it's just me who has
I
that
think
problem.
a lot of people enjoy a beautiful day or expressions on the faces opposite them.
But they don't look for metaphors in the beautiful
I'm not
day.
looking for metaphors. Lay off.
Do they follow you?
They sometimes arrive. Incidentally, I wrote a very simple poem celebrating a quatrain, celebrating the simple mechanism of the umbrella. And I was going to say my God, but I can't now. My goodness. People see so much into it. All I was dealing with was the umbrella. And it's called To Open. And people think I'm saying to open with a double O. No, it's just to open. How to open something. To open. Spokes slide upon a pole inside the parasol.
That's very deep.
I didn't.
And very metaphorical.
No, I didn't intend it as such. I just wanted the simple umbrella before they complicated it.
But if people can read something that's that simple, and they can make something more of it, or see certain meanings in it, or draw conclusions, or broaden their perspective, then haven't you really done something wonderful other than just describe the mechanism of an umbrella?
Well, if they bring all of that to the poem or the quatrain, that's fine. I'm all for it.
Don't people need to personalize things? I would hope that if I gave up years ago thinking that people would understand specifically what I was talking about, but I realized that it was far more important that they understand what I said in terms of their own life and their own emotions and thinking. And if I did that, then perhaps I did something better than just conveying a single meaning from my mind to someone else's.
Well, when I want to be published, as all writers and poets do, but when I'm making a poem, I am just concerned with getting it as exact or as precise as I can, doing the best I can to get the right words in the right place. It's a shaped object. When I send it, say a shaped stone, I throw it into the pool of another person's life, if it's that person's, and the ripples it will make in the pool of that person's life, I don't determine. So I'm not, but I know that if I've done a good job, there may be a response, but I don't determine that response.
But perhaps the ripples are shaped by the things that the ripples strike in the pond, right? And that might be the listeners.
Yes, right.
You were really getting off on a tangent.
Yes, well, every person. I'm not for confessional poetry, because confessional poetry is as if the other person hasn't got his own or her own life experience, which will either confirm the truth of the poem or not. I'm not supplying the data of my life. Everybody has his life, and the poem will reach that life or will not.
Should it ultimately be about what we have in common with other people?
I'm not worried about the other people.
You're not worried about that?
No, I'm just making a poem.
But then explain to the audience, for those who might not understand, what confessional poetry is.
Well, that's when you tell about your nervous breakdowns or your love life, or they all know what confessional poetry is. It has prevailed all too long. As a matter of fact, you asked me about the beats earlier.
Yes.
I remember
what was your appraisal.
One of the glamorous weekends of my life was about 1957. And I was invited for
It was a glamorous year of my life here, too. I was born that year. So.
Good, okay. Little did I know that I would have to contend with a whippersnapper like you. But at any rate, I was out. I had a 4th of July weekend in East Hampton, and all I heard was, the beats, it's going to be wonderful for poetry. Well, it wasn't wonderful for my poetry, because, as I said, it prevailed. And they always told you, I think Lowell was the forerunner of the confessional poetry, and then the beats did more, and that had nothing to do with me. Shall I recite a few poems that show you that I have nothing to do with them?
Certainly,
okay.
Yes.
For instance, cargo. I got that line, cargo, the first line, and it doesn't tell anything about myself in a confessional way. Cargo, old wounds leave good hollows, where one who goes can hold himself in ghostly embraces of former powers and graces, whose domain no strife mars. I am made whole by my scars, for whatever now displaces follows all that once was, and without loss stows me in to my own spaces. Now, I think it's hard to get that in the air. You have to see it. But it is as formal as any sonnet. It is from my experience of life. And I sent it to a teacher of mine, and she wrote back and said, "Thank me for this poem of thanksgiving." And I never knew it was a poem of thanksgiving.
Well, that just follows up my contention there before.
But that's great that she saw it that way. Let me say it again, since your readers don't have it on the page.
Go right ahead.
Cargo. Old wounds leave good hollows, where one who goes can hold himself in ghostly embraces of former powers and graces, whose domain no strife mars. I am made whole by my scars, for whatever now displaces follows all that once was, and without loss stows me in to my own spaces. Now, of course, I was working out a metaphor. Oh, you said about chasing birds. But there was cargo, the cargo vessel, and the hold, old ones leave good hollows, where one who goes can hold, and then the vessel stays afloat by displacing its weight, and there's stows me into my own spaces. Yeah. So there's a metaphor there, of course. As they say in France, ça va sans dire.
Now, you're also multilingual as well, am I right? You speak Spanish and French?
Yeah, actually.
How has that helped you?
Well, I can read Baudelaire in French.
That's
every new translation is whatever of Baudelaire or whoever it is the hype is always the best translation that was ever. You cannot read Baudelaire in English. Harking back to Robert Frost again, he said, poetry is that which cannot be translated. Each language is like the particular stone of this place. You cannot translate from the granite of Vermont into the marble of Carrara. The material determines at least half of what you make of it, of the poem you make, or the statue you make, I should say, not mixing my metaphors, is determined by the stone you're working with. So there.
There's a very dear friend of mine out in East Hampton, Siv Cedering, who's a wonderful Swedish poet, and she told me at one time that despite the fact she spent all of her early years in Sweden and speaks Swedish fluently and writes a lot in Sweden, in Swedish. Well, she writes for things in Sweden, television programs and things like that. But she told me that when she writes all of her poetry in English and that she will not translate it into Swedish, that she leaves that to someone else because she doesn't feel competent to translate her own poetry, which I thought was even more curious than what you had just described.
Well, if anybody can translate it, she should give him a hand. I mean,
well, there are people who do that, but she said she doesn't feel comfortable doing it herself.
Oh, incidentally, my mother tongue, although I was speaking English by the time I was 3, or even earlier, but children can handle a few languages. My mother tongue was Yiddish. My mother was taking me back to Europe to visit her parents, and she wanted me to be able to speak to them. Now, that's strangely, and not that I decided this, but I got a letter from Paul Bowles and praising me. Somebody gave him my book, praising my Anglo-Saxon diction.
Wow.
Well, I never studied Middle English or Beowulf or anything like that, but Yiddish is a German dialect, actually medieval German mostly, and so English is Anglo-Saxon. The root of English is German, and so I got a feel for the German root of English without knowing it, and most of the words I use are of the basic vocabulary, not the Latin or French words, although I know French very well. They are the words of physical experience, and even words that sound high church Anglican, like the waning moon and the waxing moon. In Yiddish or German, I know Yiddish version of German, wenig, little, waxing, wachsen, growing moon. So there. You never know.
I wanted you to recount a story quickly before we finish about your having met Marianne Moore on the street here and what that was all about. I remember being delighted by that story, and our listeners would probably like it.
Well, I was walking uptown, living on Townsend Street below Spring. The village proper is uptown. At that time, it was not Soho where I lived. Anyway, I had just taken a reject out of the mailbox, and usually I tear them up, but this one I put into my pocket, and I'd walk several blocks, and then I happened to take it out to look at it once more, a nice little note, not just the standard printed form from the late Howard Moss. And I reached...
of the New Yorker, right?
Yes, right. And I reached 10th or 11th Street, and she had, in the last years of her life, she'd moved in from Brooklyn, and she was living in an apartment on one of those streets. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, around the middle of the afternoon, or a little past, and very heavy traffic, and she was about to cross 6th Avenue, and I said, "Good afternoon, Miss Moore." She wasn't surprised to be recognized, and she said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm fine. I just got a reject from the New Yorker." Now, if it had remained in my pocket, I wouldn't have told her that, but it was in my hand. I had just taken it out to look at it, and so I helped her across the street. She was going to Balducci's that time on the other side of the street, and she took out her specs and put them on. She wanted to see this poem, and that lady sent back. And she said, as if she used to write about home runs of the Dodgers. She said, as if she'd seen a home run, "Sensational. It makes sense and leaves room for enlargement. I don't know why they didn't take it, unquote. So,
that must have made you feel wonderful.
well, yeah, I took away the reject, and 5 years later I ran to her funeral. It lifted a banner for me.
Good.
One
Just
more
tell
poem?
me quickly, give me one more poem quickly, and then just tell me in a sentence or two, how do you see the future of poetry? Is it good?
No.
Okay. Then you'll have to end with one more poem.
It's over? Okay. This one is called Night Music Pizzicato. Why am I so fond of the double bass of bullfrogs? Or do I hear the prongs of a tuning fork, not a bull fiddle, responding in perfect accord to one another across this pond? How does each frog know he is not his brother? Which frog to follow? Who was his mother? Or is it a Jew's harp I hear in the dark?
That's wonderful. Thank you, Samuel. Well, you've been listening to the second half of an interview in celebration of National Poetry Month with the eminent and eminently delightful poet Samuel Menashe of Soho and the world. Thank you, my friend. Live long and prosper. Special thanks to Ellie Buck for her engineering and technical assistance. This is your arts and literary correspondent, Dan Moran. Thank you once again for joining me here on the Long Island Radio Magazine. Until next time.
The Long Island Radio Magazine is a production of WPBX, Long Island's public radio. We'd like to hear from you. You can mail your comments to WPBX, Southampton College of Long Island University, 239 Montauk Highway, Southampton, New York, 11968. For the Long Island Radio Magazine, I'm Jeff Whalen.
Now 1 minute before 6 o'clock, you're listening to WPBX 88.3 FM, Southampton, New York, Long Island's public radio. Stay tuned to WPBX. Coming up next is the News Hour with Jim Lair. The News Hour with Jim Lair is made possible on WPBX through the generosity of WLIW-TV, Channel 21. Now 44 degrees outside our studios. Tonight's forecast, periods of rain ending towards daybreak, lows in the low to mid-40s. Stay tuned. Coming up at 7 o'clock, Evening Jazz with your host, Ed German. You're listening to Long Island's public radio station. WNET.
Good evening. I'm